During my years working at a bar in Chicago, one of my coworkers was an indie music virtuoso, one of those kinds of people who was always listening to the most up-and-coming bands and artists, incredibly tuned into the music scene. We had very different tastes. But one time, as we were closing up, he put on a song, and I loved it. I turned to him and I said, "This is really good." And he said, "Yeah, they're amazing, a once-in-a-generation talent. You really should have gone to see them, because the band broke up last week." This evening, as the sun sets, it will become the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. It is a minor fast day, and due to the brilliance of our rabbis, whenever a fast day, other than Yom Kippur, falls on Shabbat, it is postponed until the following day. So while tonight begins Tisha B'Av, we won't begin fasting until Sunday morning. And having just given you all of those disclaimers, you might be thinking, well, Rabbi, if the rabbis didn't want you to talk about Tisha B'Av on Shabbat, why are you doing it? And the answer to that is actually pretty simple. It's because I want you to hear about the band. I don't want you to hear about the band only after it's broken up. So here's the big question. Why observe Tisha B'Av? It's the question I think I heard the most during my time in rabbinical school. It's a question I constantly hear from colleagues in the field and from many educated Jews who notice that there is a dissonance around this observance in many Jewish circles. Tisha B'Av marks the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem, and it also marks the beginning of exile. And the antipathy towards this fast day seems to come from two arguments coming around those ideas. And the first one is this, that the destruction of the temple actually leads to the ascension of rabbinic Judaism and the adaptation of Judaism to fit a world without a centralized place of worship. We would not be here without the loss of the temple. The survival of Judaism as a global religion, instead of as a localized cult practice, is actually rooted in destruction. And it also goes almost without saying that progressive Jews are not particularly interested in seeing the return of the sacrificial cult. It could be equated to when a dear friend comes to you, one who is married and has a beautiful family and is distraught, pining for their very first lost love. And you want to comfort them because they're obviously hurting, but you're also very confused. Why are you so held up on something from so long ago? If you hadn't been heartbroken, then maybe you would never have gone on that trip or taken that class, which led you to your passion, which led you to your amazing spouse and those gorgeous children. But every person knows the appeal of unfulfilled fantasy, of nostalgia for a time gone by, a nostalgia so strong that it can cause heartbreak. The second argument, that Tisha B'Av leads to the exile from our land and 2,000 years of powerlessness. But in modernity, as the generation which is blessed to be alive during the creation and existence of the state of Israel, forced exile is over. Until my grandfather's final day on earth, it never failed to please and delight him that he could just go to Israel whenever he wanted, even if he wasn't going to take the opportunity, because he was a proud diaspora Jew. And from a Zionist perspective, and I've heard this more than once from my Israeli friends, Tisha B'Av is an odd fast to continue to hold on to since we're back. And one Israeli rabbi I know actually wanted to host a feast day instead of a fast day. Because yes, once upon a time, Tisha B'Av was a day of loss, but God has restored Zion's fortunes, redeemed us like dreamers. Shir hamalot beshuv Adonai et shivat Zion hayinu kecholim. To him, it was offensive, in fact, bordering on blasphemy, to continue to observe Tisha B'Av as is. And as he explained it to me with one hand on my shoulder, he said, Chaim Shmuel, Shiva ends and Shloshim ends. God doesn't say mourn forever. God says remember. So why? Why hold a day of mourning for one event which is we as a movement and as a community accept as a necessary moment for our own existence, and for a period that we gratefully acknowledge has come to an end? And sometimes the answer to these sorts of questions is we do things because they're our tradition, even if we don't personally agree with them anymore. But the most common answer I've actually heard is that Tisha B'Av is no longer just about the temple and just about the exile. Because during our long wanderings, the rabbis made Tisha B'Av a catch-all day for all of the sufferings of the Jewish people, both in the Tanakh and in their own era. The golden calf happened on Tisha B'Av. The report of the spies happened on Tisha B'Av. The failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Tisha B'Av. And as history continues, the list continues. First Crusade, expulsion from England, expulsion from Spain, founding of the Inquisition, and even tragic events which lead up to both world wars, all on Tisha B'Av. B'Shem Amro, Erev Rav Taylor Baruchel, a teaching in the name of my spouse, if not for Tisha B'Av, our calendar would be filled to the brim with days dedicated to tragedy, sadness, and loss. Instead, we've coalesced them all into a single day. Tisha B'Av is a day for communal Jewish mourning, no matter which communal loss you are mourning. Whether that is the unspeakable brutality of the Nazis or the forced expulsion of the Sephardic Jews from their homes after the founding of the State of Israel, the loss of lives to terror attacks and war, or, as I saw in an invitation just this week, the feeling of powerlessness in the face of climate crisis. Tisha B'Av does not need to be about the literal destruction our people faced 2,000 years ago. It can be about every destruction our people faces and mourns, and then, with the help of God, overcomes. Rabbi Alex Israel of the Pardes Institute for Jewish Studies argues that we should actually embrace the emptiness of the day. Tisha B'Av stands aside as a day that has no Torah reading or piyutim other than the Book of Lamentations, a day that, if observed fully, shocks the system by replicating a feeling of loss, a moment which literally leaves you sitting on the floor, unwashed and ungroomed, with nothing to read or study, which offers you any comfort. He says, a culture is marked by its institutions, its heroes, its happy days, and its sad days. And indeed, Tisha B'Av is one of those moments that crafts the Jewish soul more than any other. And I don't want to raise or rouse it with speeches and lectures. For me, this day breathes with the hushed, monotonous sound of dirges and silences. And perhaps then, in the grand hecticness of Judaism, we really need a day like Tisha B'Av to give us a full sense of life. There is gain and there is loss. There are high points and there are low. There is the busy fullness of Shabbat rest, and there is the empty discomfort of Tisha B'Av. Personally, I resonate with the words of Rabbi Alan Liu. In his book, This is Real, and You Are Completely Unprepared, Rabbi Liu makes it clear that to him, the real reason to observe Tisha B'Av is that it marks the vital first step on our journey into Teshuvah. Tisha B'Av, for Rabbi Liu, is the beginning of the High Holy Days. We can regard the 9th of Av and the week surrounding it as a cursed time, or we can regard the 9th of Av as a time when we are reminded that catastrophe will keep recurring in our lives until we get things right, until we learn what we need to learn from them. Tisha B'Av is the moment of turning, the moment when we turn away from denial and begin to face exile and alienation as they manifest in our lives, in our alienation and estrangement from God, and in our alienation and estrangement from ourselves and others. On the High Holy Days, we are called to remember both our shortcomings and our ability to remedy our failures with acts of kindness, love, and forgiveness. Not only as individual human beings, but actually as a greater Jewish community. And on Tisha B'Av, we are given the most honest and piercing communal tochacha imaginable, a reminder of our lowest point. And just as one would never run a race without training, or sing without warming up, or do yoga without stretching, and ever expect the results to be helpful or even healthy, spiritual activity requires that first warm-up step. Our observance of this fast, then, is the beginning of our communal training that we will need to have a meaningful Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. They were amazing, a once-in-a-lifetime talent. You should have seen them. They broke up last week. It is my dear hope that if any of these perspectives resonated with you, that you will join us on Sunday morning at 9 in our chapel for our observance of Tisha B'Av. And while the reason that each of us may walk through that door will be different, ultimately, we will pray and study as a community along with our Jewish siblings across the world. And that act of unity, that may itself be reason enough. Shabbat Shalom.